He assumed that this encounter would be nothing more than another ordinary routine stop, a minor interruption marked by a few terse threats and a bit of humiliation, all executed on his own terms. That was the plan, or so he believed. Yet everything changed in an instant when he opened the trunk of my car. His confident expression faltered, and he froze in place as his eyes locked onto a document that, unbeknownst to him at that moment, would alter the course of his life forever. In that heartbeat, I realized that the performance was only just beginning. Sometimes in life, the predator becomes the prey, and tonight was destined to be a night he would never, ever forget. It had been one of those moments when you sense something is off even before it happens. It's like that eerie calm just before a storm when the air becomes too still and heavy with anticipation. That was me, driving down Main Street on a dreary evening. The rain was falling in a light drizzle, and my windshield wipers struggled valiantly to keep up with the steady cascade of droplets. Everything felt out of sorts. I was making my way home after an exhausting day, the kind where your brain feels like mush, and all you crave is the comforting solitude of a hot shower and absolute silence. Then, as if on cue, I caught sight of the flashing red and blue lights in my rearview mirror. "A police cruiser," I muttered under my breath, my mind racing through the possibilities. I wasn't speeding, my taillights were in proper working order, and my license plates were completely legitimate, so what was going on? A sinking suspicion soon replaced my initial confusion. This was the classic case of being pulled over because I looked different. In that moment, I knew exactly what was happening. With a resigned sigh, I pulled over to the side of the road. My hands instinctively took their positions on the steering wheel, at the customary 10 and 2 positions because, as we all know, that's the protocol. The police cruiser eventually came to a stop, and I watched as a burly man clad in a pressed uniform stepped out. His boots made a distinct crunching sound on the wet pavement, and his entire demeanor exuded authority, as if he were the undisputed ruler of this town. I was already weary from the day's toll when he barked, "License and registration," without so much as a greeting. There was no polite good evening or any semblance of courtesy. It was straight to business. His tone was not a request, it was an order, one that implied I had already committed some grave misdeed. "Good evening, officer," I replied calmly, striving to maintain an even tone. "May I ask why you pulled me over? You seem to think I was driving suspiciously slow." He squinted at me, as if my very presence had been an insult to his mother, and I blinked in confusion. Suspiciously slow? Was that even a valid complaint? I wondered aloud. "It's raining, you know. I'm merely being cautious." He leaned in closer, droplets of water clinging to the brim of his hat, and said, "Careful, huh? You got something to hide in this car, pal?" That single word, pal, was uttered with a condescending sneer, not a respectful sir or mister, but an all-too familiar term of derision that felt loaded with disdain. I answered coolly, "Officer, I have nothing to hide. Everything in here is in order." I slowly reached for my license and registration from the glove compartment, carefully emphasizing the slowness of my movement so as not to incite any further suspicion. The last thing I needed was for him to believe I was reaching for a concealed weapon. Instead, he snatched the documents from my hand and gave them a cursory glance, as if the effort was too much to spare. "Stay right here," he ordered, his tone leaving no room for argument. He stomped back to his cruiser, and I watched him through the side mirror, half expecting him to summon backup or engage in some theatrical display of authority. Something about his behavior screamed that this was not going to be a simple exchange. When he returned, his irritation was plain to see, as though he had been waiting for a reason to escalate the situation, only to find none. He then stepped out of his vehicle and said in a clipped tone, "Step out of the vehicle." I asked, "What's the reason, officer?" My tone remained polite yet firm as I continued, "I have done nothing wrong," but he repeated his command, enunciating every word as though I were hard of hearing. "Step out of the vehicle." With a heavy sigh, I complied. Arguing further would only worsen the situation, so I stepped out into the drizzle. The cold, wet rain seeped through my jacket almost immediately. Then came the unexpected order. "Open the trunk," he demanded, gesturing decisively toward the back of my car. "Officer, with all due respect," I began, "you need a warrant for that." His face twisted into a smirk that made my stomach churn. "You see," he said with a defiant tone, That's where you're wrong. I can check whatever I damn well please. No, actually, you cannot, I replied steadily, my voice low but firm, yet he paid no heed to my protestations as he strode purposefully toward the trunk. Fumbling with his keyring, he acted as if he owned the car, completely disregarding my rights. Officer, you are violating my rights, I said louder, trying to assert some control over the situation, but he ignored my words, popping the trunk open as if it were his own personal treasure chest. That was when he saw it, a sleek grey document case sitting neatly in the corner of the trunk. What's this? He inquired, his tone shifting suddenly to one of curiosity mixed with suspicion. Personal property, I stated sharply. You have no right to be holding that. But he was already reaching for the case. My heart began to pound in my chest as he unlatched the case and opened it for a split second. I found myself nearly amused by his eagerness, as if he were a child unwrapping a birthday present. Until his expression abruptly froze. His face turned as pale as chalk as his eyes scanned the document lying neatly on top. Whatever confidence he'd possessed seemed to vanish in that instant. His jaw tightened, and his hands trembled ever so slightly as he held the paper closer to his face. Officer Thomas H. Hendrick, I said, watching the dawning realization in his eyes. Do you want to explain why you just violated the rights of your new boss? I continued, letting the irony hang in the air. Let me tell you something about men like you, Officer Hendrick. They never know when to quit. Seriously, you were acting as if you had just uncovered the biggest case of your life, yet all you had to show for it was my trunk filled with nothing, well, nothing except for that grey document case. When I saw him pull it out, he murmured, clearly still in shock. You have no idea about the storm you just walked into. Holding the case as if it were a trophy, his forced smirk began to crumble. What's in here? He asked, his voice regaining some semblance of its earlier confidence. I replied coolly, put it down, though inside I was screaming. This was my private property, and he was way out of line. Yet he ignored me once more. In a moment of big shock, he popped the latches on the case, and with a soft, almost imperceptible click, he flipped it open to examine its contents. That was when the magic happened. His eyes landed on the top sheet of paper, and you'd have thought he'd seen a ghost. The color drained from his face so rapidly that I half expected him to collapse right there in the rain. He squinted at the document, and then blinked several times, as though he hoped it would somehow transform into something else entirely. Wait a minute. What the hell is this? He muttered under his breath, his voice now stripped of its earlier cocky edge and replaced with a nervous tremor. Oh, how the tables have turned, I remarked, leaning casually against my car. What's the matter, Officer Hendrick? Did something catch your eye? He didn't offer any response. His hands were still shaking as he clutched the paper even closer to his face. I could clearly see the big, bold letters at the top of the document. From my vantage point, it read, Notice of Termination. Beneath that heading, his name was printed in full, unmistakable and clear, followed by a list of offenses that would make anyone reconsider hiring someone for even the simplest of jobs. Jobs like babysitting, for instance. This can't be real, he stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. He looked up at me, and I swear I had never seen a man transition so abruptly from arrogance to sheer terror. What the hell is this? He managed to ask, his words coming out haltingly. I crossed my arms and allowed myself a slow, deliberate smile. That, my friend, is a very official document, and you are holding it without permission. He blinked at me, as though I had just spoken in an ancient language. Permission? You? What? What is going on here? He stuttered. Why don't you read the entire document? I suggested calmly, tilting my head toward the paper. It might clear up some of your confusion. I could almost see the wheels turning in his head, and let me tell you, they were squeaking. His eyes darted back to the paper, and I watched as the words sank into his consciousness. The offenses, the complaints, the recommendation for immediate dismissal, and finally the signature at the bottom. It read, James Peterson, Chief of Police. You're the... He began, but his words were cut off as his face went even paler, like the clouds above us. This can't be real, he managed to say, his voice trembling. I'm not, I interrupted him by raising an eyebrow. Your new boss, I stated coolly. Sorry to disappoint, but yes, that is exactly who I am. For a few long moments his mouth opened and closed like a fish flopping helplessly on dry land, and I could hardly contain my satisfaction. He tried to protest weakly, his voice barely audible. "Look, this has to be a mistake," he finally managed, stuttering. "You're not supposed to, you're—" Before he could finish, I raised a hand to stop him. "Let me stop you right there," I said sharply. "I was brought in to clean up this department, and guess what? Your name was at the very top of my list." His hands dropped to his sides, the paper still clutched tightly between his trembling fingers, and he looked as though he had been hit by a freight train. "Look, we can work this out," he pleaded weakly, his voice dripping with desperation. I didn't mean anything by it." "Oh, you didn't mean anything by it," I interrupted, my tone laced with biting sarcasm. "So when you stopped me for absolutely no reason, searched my car without a warrant and violated my private property, it was all just a big misunderstanding?" His tone shifted desperately as he tried to salvage his dignity. "Come on, man," he insisted, his voice rising in panic. "I didn't know who you were, and that makes it okay, doesn't it?" I shot back, my voice steady and cold. "What if I wasn't your boss? Would that make your actions acceptable?" I paused, letting the weight of my words sink in. "Hendrick, that's not how the law works, not anymore." His face contorted into a mixture of panic and disbelief, and I could see the gears in his head turning furiously, trying to figure out a way to extricate himself from the massive hole he had just dug. "Please," he whispered in a barely audible tone, "just give me a chance to explain." I shook my head slowly. "Oh, don't worry, Hendrick," I said, my voice resonating with finality. "You'll get your chance to explain, just not to me." With that, I pulled out my phone and made the call that would officially mark the end of his career. The rain continued its steady descent, but for the first time that night, I felt completely in control. There we were, me standing in the rain as calm as a cucumber, and Officer Hendrick looking utterly defeated, as if he had just been struck by a bus. The document, the very paper that sealed his fate, seemed to be burning in his hands with how quickly he tried to conceal it. He opened his mouth, perhaps to offer some excuse or a desperate plea, but I wasn't about to give him that satisfaction. "Go ahead," I said, crossing my arms and leaning back against my car. "Say whatever it is you think might save your job." I could hear the tremor in his voice as he began, sounding as shaky as a leaf in the wind. "This was just a misunderstanding, okay? I didn't know who you were, and oh, so it's okay to violate someone's rights as long as they're not your boss?" I cut him off sharply, my tone as cold and unforgiving as a winter gale. "Hendrick, am I wrong?" He blinked furiously, his mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. Finally, after a long, agonizing pause, he managed to utter, "No. That's not..." But I was relentless. "Look, I'm just saying that perhaps we don't have to take this any further. I can fix this. I can accept an apology." His voice faltered, and I could sense his desperation. I'm sorry," he stammered, his words laden with hopelessness. "That's rich," I responded with a bitter laugh. "Tell me, Hendrick, how many people have you pulled this kind of stunt on before? How many drivers have ended up with a document in their trunk that forced you to backpedal?" His silence was deafening. He looked down at the wet pavement, as though the answers lay etched into its surface, but we both knew the truth. This wasn't his first rodeo, and it wouldn't be his last if he hadn't run into me. "Yeah, that's what I thought," I said, shaking my head slowly. "You're not sorry, Hendrick. You're only sorry because you got caught." "Come on, man," he pleaded again, his voice dripping with desperation. "You've got to understand that this job is everything to me. I made a mistake, okay? But I can learn. I can change. Just please don't do this." I stared at him for a long, heavy moment, allowing his pitiful words to hang in the air. The rain persisted, soaking both of us in its cold, unrelenting drizzle, but I didn't care. This wasn't about him. It was about all those who had come before me, those who never had the chance to stand up for themselves, those who were denied the power to speak out. "You want to change?" I finally asked, my voice steady and cold as steel. "Then prove it. But know this, you are not doing it in my department." His face crumpled like a discarded paper bag, and for a brief moment I truly thought he might start to cry. "You can't do this," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I need this job." "No," I said firmly, cutting him off. What you needed was a wake-up call. I reached for my phone once more and dialed the number I had been saving for this exact moment. The line rang once before a crisp, familiar voice answered. "Chief Peterson speaking." "It's me," I said simply. "I've got Officer Hendrick here with me. Effective immediately, he's terminated. Notify HR and expedite the paperwork." As the words left my mouth, Hendrick's eyes widened with the sudden, crushing reality that had descended upon him like a freight train. Wait, you don't have to do this," he stammered, his voice rising in panic. "Please, I'll do whatever you want." I held up a hand to silence him. "It's done, Hendrick. Pack your things, turn in your badge and gun by the end of the day, and don't even think about appealing. The complaints against you are well documented." I ended the call without giving him a chance to protest further. When I looked back at Hendrick, he stood frozen in place, his face a bewildering mixture of disbelief and sheer terror. It was the look of a man who had just realized that his worst nightmare had come crashing down upon him. I stepped closer, my voice low and filled with finality. "Here's a tip for you," I said. "Next time you don't a uniform, if anyone is ever foolish enough to hand you one again, remember what that uniform is supposed to represent. It stands for protect and serve, not for harassing and intimidating innocent people." He said nothing in response. Instead, he simply stood there, drenched and defeated, as I carefully picked up the document case and closed the trunk. The rain continued to fall, relentless and unremitting, and I felt a quiet satisfaction knowing that justice had, in this moment, been served. I then turned and walked away, the sound of my footsteps merging with the patter of the rain, leaving Officer Hendrick standing in the midst of his shattered illusions. In that moment, I realized that power, when abused, always finds a way to come crashing down. The storm that had gathered that night was not just in the sky, but within the very soul of a man who had forgotten what it meant to truly serve and protect. And as I made my way into the darkness of the rainy night, I knew that nothing would ever be the same again. For that one fateful evening, a routine stop had transformed into a pivotal turning point, a reckoning where roles were reversed and the mighty fell. The document case, with its contents of termination and disillusionment, had become a symbol of retribution. Officer Hendrick, who had once strut with the arrogance of a man who ruled the streets, now stood as a stark reminder that even those in positions of power are not immune to accountability. In the quiet aftermath of the storm, as the rain continued to wash away the remnants of a misguided authority, I couldn't help but reflect on the events that had unfolded. It was a night of transformation, not just for the man who had dared to abuse his power, but for the system that had long been taken for granted. The revelation hidden within that grey document case was a clarion call, a reminder that no one is above the law, and that sometimes the very hand that seeks to oppress is met with a force even stronger, the force of truth and accountability. And so, as I drove away from that scene, leaving behind the shattered remnants of a career and the broken pride of a man who once believed himself invincible, I felt a deep, abiding sense of justice. The night had been a crucible, forging a new reality where power was not a shield against consequences, but a responsibility to uphold the principles of fairness and integrity. In that moment, I knew that every drop of rain, every flash of red and blue in the mirror had led to this singular, defining moment, a moment where the predator had indeed become the prey. The city, cloaked in the melancholy of the rain, continued on its way, oblivious to the monumental change that had just taken place on one quiet stretch of Main Street. But I knew that the impact of that night would echo far beyond the confines of that brief encounter. It was a testament to the resilience of those who refused to be subjugated by unjust authority, a reminder that even in the darkest hours, the light of accountability can pierce through the shadow. As I merged back into the flow of traffic, my mind replayed every detail of the encounter. The way his confident demeanor had melted into panic, the way the document case had held the key to his downfall, and the profound irony of a routine stop evolving into a dramatic retribution. Every moment had been etched into my memory, a narrative of defiance, retribution, and ultimately, the triumph of justice over tyranny. And so I continued my journey home, the rain still falling, each droplet carrying away the remnants of a corrupt past, while heralding the dawn of a new order. I knew that many would come to recount the tale of that stormy night, a night when the tables turned, when the predator was undone by his own overreach, and when one simple document case became the instrument of his undoing. In the days and weeks that followed, whispers of that encounter spread quietly through the corridors of power and the streets alike. For some, it was a cautionary tale of the dangers inherent in abusing authority. For others, it was a beacon of hope that even the most entrenched corruption could be challenged and overcome. And though Officer Hendrick's fate was sealed that night, the reverberations of his fall would serve as a powerful reminder to all who dared to wield power without accountability. Looking back now, I see that evening as a turning point in a long struggle, a moment when the scales of justice were finally rebalanced. The rain, the flashing lights, the cold commands, and the trembling hands all converged into a singular narrative of transformation and redemption. And while the events of that night may have been fraught with tension and terror for one man, for me they signified the triumph of a deeper, unyielding truth. That true authority is earned through integrity, not coercion, that those who serve must do so with respect, not intimidation, and that in the end, even the most oppressive forces can be overthrown by the unassailable power of accountability. Thus, as I arrived home and stepped into the refuge of my quiet sanctuary, the storm outside gradually subsided, leaving behind a silence that was both eerie and liberating. I knew that life, in its infinite complexity, would never be quite the same, but in that change lay the promise of a better future. One where the lessons of that rainy night would serve as a guiding light for all who believed in justice. In the years that followed, I often found myself reflecting on that fateful encounter. I recalled the unwavering determination in my own voice, the resolute calm that had enabled me to stand firm against injustice. I remembered the way the rain had seemed to echo the tumultuous emotions of that night, washing away the remnants of corruption and heralding the start of something new. And each time I was reminded that even in the face of overwhelming odds, the truth has a way of emerging victorious. Every detail of that evening, the precise moment the officer's expression changed, the sound of his heavy boots on the wet pavement, the relentless drumming of the rain on the roof of my car, remained indelibly etched in my memory. They served as constant reminders that power, when wielded without conscience, can lead to catastrophic consequences, and they underscored the fundamental truth that accountability must always prevail over arrogance. Now, as I recount these events, I do so not out of bitterness or vindictiveness, but rather as a testament to the enduring strength of integrity. It is a story of how one ordinary night became extraordinary, a night when the established order was upended, and the relentless march of justice proved unstoppable. The document case, the rain, the flashing lights, and the trembling hands of a man who once believed himself untouchable all coalesced into a narrative that will long be remembered as a turning point in our shared pursuit of fairness and decency. In that extended moment of confrontation, as the storm raged both outside and within, I witnessed the collapse of a false authority, a moment when the harsh realities of the world came crashing down on a man who had forgotten his duty to serve and protect. And while the memory of that night may fade with time, the lessons it imparted will remain with me always. A reminder that every action has its consequences, and that true leadership is defined by respect for both the law and the people it is meant to serve. So it was on that rain-soaked night, amid the flickering lights and the echo of commands, that a new chapter began. A chapter where accountability was not an abstract concept, but a tangible force, capable of reshaping lives and rewriting destinies. And as I moved forward into the night, I carried with me the steadfast belief that every individual, no matter how powerful, must eventually answer for their actions. For in that unyielding truth lies the promise of a better, more just future for all. In conclusion, the encounter that had started as a seemingly mundane stop evolved into an unforgettable saga of transformation. What began as a routine interaction laced with tension and the undercurrent of bias culminated in a decisive act of retribution. The document that Officer Hendrick found in my trunk was not merely paper and ink, it was the symbol of a turning tide, a declaration that those who abuse power will ultimately be held accountable. The relentless rain, the determined cadence of my words, and the unwavering resolve that resonated with every syllable ensured that justice was not a distant ideal, but an immediate reality. The night, filled with the promise of change, demonstrated that even in the midst of oppressive circumstances, the spirit of truth and accountability can shine through. And as I walked away, leaving behind the remnants of a broken regime, I knew that this was only the beginning of a new era, a time when power would be redefined, not by intimidation, but by a commitment to protect and serve with honor. Thus the storm had passed, and in its wake a new order was taking shape. The echoes of that night would forever serve as a reminder that every act of defiance in the face of injustice, no matter how small, has the potential to ignite a revolution of accountability. And while Officer Hendrick's career ended abruptly in the downpour, his fate became a cautionary tale for all who might dare to abuse their authority in the future. In the end, that rain-soaked encounter was more than just a moment of retribution. It was a reaffirmation of the fundamental values that bind us together as a society. It was a declaration that no one, no matter how high their station, is above the law. And it was a lesson that would resonate long after the storm had cleared, inspiring others to stand up, speak out, and demand a better, fairer world.